Welcome to Reflect with Ed Fassio. Get ready to experience one of the world's first 100% digitally generated podcasts, where we take a step back, dive deep, and strive to learn new things. Join us as we unpack thought-provoking ideas, personal reflections, and inspiring stories to help you stay in the know. Reflect is brought to you by the minds at ByteBrain and powered by emerging technologies from Google, HeyGen, OpenAI, and 11 Labs. Thanks for tuning in. Now, relax and prepare to reflect.
All right, so strap yourselves in, folks, because today we are going deep into a story of survival that's going to leave you, well, speechless.
Yeah, this one is a doozy.
It's the 1972 Andes flight disaster.
A story so wild it makes those Bear Grylls episodes look like a walk in the park, really.
A walk in the park, seriously. All right, so picture this. A plane jam-packed with a Uruguayan rugby team.
The Old Christians Club.
The Old Christians Club, their families, friends, the whole shebang.
45 people on board.
45 souls. Slams right into the Andes Mountains. Miles from civilization, freezing their you-know-whats off.
Oh, yeah.
And their snack stash. Let's just say it's about as plentiful as a vegan butcher shop.
It's a pretty bleak scenario, no doubt about it.
Bleak is putting it mildly.
45 people suddenly finding themselves, grappling with the brutal reality of the Andes at a dizzying elevation of 12,000 feet.
Hold on, 12,000 feet. That's higher than my hopes of ever understanding cryptocurrency.
I hear you.
And you said remote. How far were they from like a hot shower, a decent pizza, civilization?
Oh, they were about as off the grid as you can get.
Really?
The wreckage, it ended up in this glacial valley in Argentina near the Chilean border.
Okay.
But a good 50 miles east of their intended flight path. So, yeah, talk about a serious detour.
So we got a rugby team turned into accidental mountaineers. What the hell happened? I mean, was it a rogue flock of geese?
Well,
Mid-air disco party gone wrong?
well, no. It was a chartered flight.
Right.
The team, the Old Christians, were on their way to a match in Santiago, Chile. Bad weather forced them to make a pit stop in Mendoza, Argentina.
Mendoza.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where things, took a turn.
Good turn. Okay, so let's break down this Mendoza layover. Was it the weather, ultimately, that sent them spiraling into the mountains?
Well, weather definitely played a role. But the co-pilot, who was flying at the time, he made a critical navigational error. Yeah, he mistakenly believed they were further along than they actually were and started descending for landing while still cruising over the Andes.
Ooh, big mistake.
Yeah.
So they basically played bumper cars with a mountain.
Pretty much. The plane clipped a peak, lost both rings, the tail section, bye-bye.
I can't even imagine the terror. I mean, those passengers must have felt just...
It's unimaginable.
So the fuselage, everyone's still inside.
Yeah.
Basically tobogganed down a glacier.
It did. Careening for about half a mile before slamming into a snowbank.
Ooh.
The impact was devastating. Some died instantly, while others succumbed to injuries and, the bone-chilling temperatures in the immediate aftermath.
It's a miracle anyone survived at all.
It is.
I mean, I read 29 people were still alive after the impact.
Mm.
They had each other, sure, but they were still stuck in a frozen wasteland,
They were stranded, injured, freezing, and their supplies were, about as useful as a screen door on a submarine.
Talk about a recipe for disaster.
Their food, mostly snacks and a few bottles of wine, vanished within a week. So they were melting snow for drinking water, using seat covers for warmth, basically playing a real-life game of Survivor.
With Mother Nature as the ultimate judge. Okay, so this is where the MacGyver instincts kick in, right? They had to get creative just to survive those first few days.
You bet. They piled up seats to create this makeshift shelter, within the broken fuselage. They even fashioned sunglasses out of whatever they could find to protect their eyes from snow blindness.
Really?
Yeah, and they even figured out how to use the plane's metal panels to collect water. Talk about resourcefulness.
No.
Under pressure.
Mind-boggling, the kind of resilience they displayed.
Yeah.
But I mean, as the days turned into weeks and their meager food supply dwindled, they were, forced to make a decision.
Yeah, a choice so harrowing.
So harrowing.
It became the most controversial chapter of their entire ordeal.
They made the unimaginable decision to consume the bodies of their deceased companions.
Faced with starvation, no sign of rescue.
Yeah. That's heavy stuff. I mean, this wasn't some Bear Grylls style stunt. This was a life or death decision born out of pure desperation. It's hard to even fathom, like the emotional, the spiritual toll that must have taken.
It was a decision that would haunt many of them long after their rescue. They were devout Catholics, and this act went against everything they believed in, yet they rationalized it as a necessary sacrifice to honor the memory of their friends by choosing to live.
It's a heavy concept to wrap your head around. It's chilling, but also reveals that raw, primal instinct for survival. That kicks in when you're pushed to the absolute limit.
And it wasn't a decision made lightly, believe me. They wrestled with it. They prayed. And ultimately convinced themselves it was a way to fulfill the pact they had made to help each other survive.
So they found a way to nourish their bodies. But what about their hope? Did that start to fade as the days turned into weeks?
There were moments of despair, especially after an avalanche slammed into the fuselage, burying it in snow and killing 8 more people.
An avalanche.
Yeah. Seriously. Talk about adding insult to injury. How in the world did anyone survive that?
It was a stroke of luck, plain and simple. They were buried alive for 3 days, trapped inside the snow-filled fuselage with the bodies of their friends. One survivor managed to pry open a cockpit window.
Oh, wow.
Creating this tiny vent for air, a lifeline in their frozen tomb.
Seriously intense stuff. But even after being buried alive, they still clung to hope.
They did. Some had been exploring the area around the crash site, desperately seeking a way out. They even found the tail section of the plane and thought they'd struck gold when they discovered the radio.
The radio. Did it work? Could they finally call for help? Was this their ticket out of this nightmare?
Sadly, no. The radio needed a specific power source that they just didn't have. It was devastating. A real punch in the gut.
Talk about a roller coaster of emotions.
Yeah.
High hopes one minute, crush the next. So at this point, they realize they can't passively wait for a rescue that might never come.
Right?
They had to take matters into their own hands. Exactly. They knew their only chance was to get out of there, to find help on their own. And that meant facing the treacherous Andes head-on.
So who stepped up for this mission impossible? Who were the brave souls who volunteered for this incredibly dangerous trek?
Well, 3 of the strongest survivors decided to risk it all. Canessa, one of the medical students, he was determined to go. Parrado, who had tragically lost his mother and sister in the crash, felt he had nothing left to lose. And Vizintin, known for his strength and resilience, joined them.
These guys weren't exactly seasoned mountain climbers.
No.
They were starving, emotionally shattered, and facing a journey through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. What did they think their odds of success were?
Their hope was a fragile thing, clinging to the co-pilot's last words, which hinted they had flown over Purico.
Purico?
Yeah, a Chilean town. They figured they were close to the western edge of the Andes and could hike their way to safety. Tragically, they were wrong.
Oh, no.
The Chilean countryside was a distant 89 kilometers to the west, a heartbreaking miscalculation.
So they set off on this with a 3-day supply of rations into this vast, unknown wilderness. Their hopes pinned on a whisper of a possibility. Just thinking about it makes my stomach clench.
They had that raw human will to survive, but also the immense weight of responsibility for those they left behind at the crash site.
Yeah.
Every step they took carried the burden of 16 lives.
Oh, their journey was just beginning. And let me tell you, it was one for the history books.
Oh, yeah. We'll delve into the incredible details of their expedition in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back. Last we left off, Canessa, Parrado, and Vizintin had just set out on their mission to find help, their backpacks loaded with, well, more hope than supplies, really.
More hope than supplies, you got that right. Talk about pressure, right? These guys were rugby players, not mountain goats. They were weak, they were grieving, and about to tackle some of the most brutal terrain on the planet. What were they thinking? Did they actually think they could, pull this off?
Well, their hope was fueled by desperation, really,
Yep.
and a sliver of misinformation.
They thought they were, near the edge of the Andes, like a quick jaunt to civilization. But the reality, they were staring down an 89-kilometer trek through a frozen hell.
Okay, so picture this. 3 guys, barely standing, after weeks of, surviving on scraps. And they're facing a journey that would make even the most seasoned explorer, think twice. Where do they even begin? Where do they even start?
First, they had to climb. Remember, they crashed in a glacial valley.
Right.
Getting out meant scaling a massive peak over 15,000 feet high.
Dude, that's like climbing Mount Everest on an empty stomach. Were they delirious?
Maybe a little. But they were also driven by a force that, most of us can only imagine. The will to survive and the responsibility for the lives of their friends back at the crash site. Thin air, bone-chilling cold, treacherous slopes. I mean, everything was working against them.
They had that hand-stitched sleeping bag, right? The one made from, like, plain insulation. I mean, that thing had to be their best friend.
It was their lifeline, literally. Canessa described those nights huddled together in that bag as, some of the coldest he'd ever experienced. It was the only thing keeping them from, becoming human popsicles.
So they're climbing for days. Their bodies are, screaming in protest. And then they reach the top of this, this massive ridge. What do they see? Palm trees.
Yeah.
A welcoming committee with hot cocoa.
Not quite. Instead of that, Chilean countryside they were expecting, they saw more mountains, stretching as far as the eye could see.
Oh, man. Can you imagine the gut punch? It would have been enough to make most people just, collapse in despair, give up.
Yeah.
And at this point, after days of, back-breaking climbing, they had to be running on fumes. Did they consider turning back, just throwing in the towel?
There was a moment, a flicker of doubt. But Parrado, he was something else. He had this, fire in his belly, this unwavering determination. "We may be walking to our deaths," he said, "but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me."
Damn. That's a powerful statement. And Canessa, he bought into this all-or-nothing plan.
He did. They saw a valley, it seemed to lead west, a glimmer of hope in a sea of white. They descended the ridge, their bodies battered, their spirits fragile, and they pushed on. For 7 more days they trekked, battling exhaustion, gnawing hunger, and the constant threat of avalanches. Their hope, it was flickering like a candle in the wind.
7 more days. That's insane. What were they even eating at this point? Snow cones with a side of, ice chips?
Their meager rations were long gone.
Right.
They were desperate, scavenging for anything, remotely edible. They even tried chewing on strips of leather torn from their luggage.
Just the desperation, the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. It's hard to even comprehend. Did they find any signs of life during those, grueling 7 days? Anything to suggest that they weren't just, wandering into oblivion?
At first, it was just more of the same. Endless mountains, blinding snow. It was a landscape that seemed determined to just swallow them whole. But slowly, ever so slowly, signs of life started to emerge. A rusted can, a glint of metal in the vast whiteness. Then a horseshoe, a sign that humans had been there. Sometime, somewhere. And finally, like a mirage shimmering in the distance, they spotted a herd of cows grazing in a distant field.
Cows. After weeks of nothing but snow and ice, those cows must have looked like, a 5-star buffet.
You can imagine the surge of hope, right? It was a beacon, a signal that they were getting closer to civilization, closer to rescue.
But they weren't out of the woods yet, right? Spotting a few cows doesn't exactly scream mission accomplished. What happened next?
Well, Canessa was on the verge of collapse. They had to rest, regroup, and as they were gathering firewood, their eyes fell upon 3 men on horseback, across a roaring river.
This is it, right? The moment of truth. Did they make contact? Did those horsemen see them?
Parrado, fueled by, adrenaline and desperation, tried to shout across the river, but his voice was just lost in the roar of the water. It was heartbreaking, so close and yet so far. But then, one of the horsemen, Sergio Catalan, he spotted them, this tiny flicker of movement against the vast landscape. He signaled that he would return the next day.
Man, that must have been the longest night of their lives.
Yeah.
After everything they endured, the uncertainty, the waiting, it must have been just agonizing.
It was a night filled with, a mix of hope and terror. But Catalan, true to his word, returned the next morning. He couldn't cross the raging river, so he tossed a rock with a note tied to it, a lifeline of words, hurled across this chasm.
What did the note say? Was this finally the help they had risked everything for?
Parrado, his hand shaking with urgency, scribbled a desperate message on the note. "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We need to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are very weak. When are you going to come to get us? Please, we can't even walk. Where are we?"
Wow. You can practically feel the desperation pouring out of that note. It's a testament to their, willpower, their refusal to give up, even when facing, the abyss.
It was a message that carried the weight of 16 lives, a message that would change everything.
So Catalan reads this note, this plea for help from 3 ghosts who, emerged from the frozen wilderness. What does he do?
Catalan, without hesitation, mounted his horse and rode for 10 hours straight to get help. He alerted the authorities, and within 2 days, helicopters were thundering towards the crash site, carrying with them the promise of salvation.
After 72 days, their ordeal was finally over. It's almost impossible to believe they made it.
It was a moment of, pure, unadulterated relief, but also a moment tinged with sorrow. They had survived, but the memories of those they had lost, the choices they had made, would stay with them forever. A constant reminder of the price they had paid for their survival.
Their rescue was just the beginning of another chapter, one filled with challenges and complexities they could never have imagined.
Yeah. We'll explore the aftermath of their rescue and the legacy of their incredible story in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we're back, and we're wrapping up our deep dive into the Andes flight disaster. Over 50 years have passed since that, fateful crash. And the story of those 16 survivors, well, it just continues to grip our imaginations, right?
Yeah.
But their rescue, as miraculous as it was just the beginning of another harrowing journey. One that took place not in the, frozen Andes, but in the glare of the world's spotlight.
Absolutely. Their return to civilization, it was a whirlwind, physically and emotionally scarred.
Oh.
They faced a world that, was struggling to comprehend what they had endured, a world both captivated and horrified by their tale of survival.
So picture this. You've just emerged from, like, a frozen hell. You've cheated death, I don't know, a dozen times over. And now you're, bam, thrust into a media frenzy. Talk about a rude awakening.
The media, they descended upon them like, vultures.
Vultures, yeah.
Hungry for every detail of their 72-day ordeal. Reporters from around the globe clamored for interviews, eager to capture, the raw emotion of their reunion with their loved ones.
And, of course, the elephant in the room, the question on everyone's mind was how they managed to survive for so long on such limited supplies.
Right.
Right.
Initially, the survivors chose to keep the details of their cannibalism pact private, sharing them only with their families. They feared the judgment, the inevitable backlash.
But secrets, especially ones this big, have a way of, finding their way into the light.
Yeah, it didn't take long. Some Chilean newspapers, maybe driven by, the insatiable hunger for a sensational scoop, they published photos taken by rescuers at the crash site. Photos that clearly showed human remains that had been, consumed. The world gasped, and the story exploded.
Boom. Just like that, their secret was out. And the world was reeling, forced to confront the harsh realities of survival in its most extreme form. How did the survivors handle the fallout?
They held a press conference. It was a raw and vulnerable moment where they bravely told their story, explaining the pact that they had made, the desperate rationale behind their choice.
Imagine the weight of that moment. I mean, standing before the world, bearing your soul, knowing that some would condemn you, others would try to understand. What was their explanation? How did they justify something that, to many, seemed to cross a fundamental moral boundary?
One survivor, he drew a parallel to the Last Supper, where Jesus shared bread and wine, symbolizing his body and blood. It was a way to, make sense of the unthinkable, to find spiritual solace in a situation that defied all moral conventions.
It's a powerful analogy, a way to reframe their actions, not as an act of, savagery, but as a ritual of sacrifice, a way to honor their friends and ensure the survival of the group.
Yeah. It resonated with many. A Catholic priest, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances, heard their confessions and offered absolution. The church, in this instance, seemed to understand the impossible choices they had faced.
Okay, so some condemned, some understood, but the debate raged on. What about the survivors themselves? I mean, how did they cope with the weight of their experience, the loss of their friends, the moral burden of their actions?
It was a long and arduous journey back to some semblance of normalcy, Many suffered from PTSD, haunted by nightmares, crippled by survivor's guilt. They had to grapple with the profound psychological impact of their ordeal, the trauma of loss and the haunting memories of their desperate choices.
Did any of them ever return to the crash site, to that place that, held so much pain, so much loss, but also, in a strange way, so much triumph?
Some did, years later, perhaps to find closure, perhaps to pay tribute to those they had lost. The remains of the victims were eventually buried in a common grave at the crash site, marked by a simple stone altar and a cross.
It's a poignant image. A place of tragedy transformed into a place of remembrance, a reminder of the fragility of life and the astonishing resilience, really, of the human spirit.
Absolutely. Their story has transcended the headlines, Inspiring books, documentaries, feature films. Each retelling offers a different lens through which to view their experience. But the core message, it remains the same. The power of hope, the tenacity of the human will, and the, extraordinary lengths we'll go to for those we love.
The Andes flight disaster. It's more than just a survival story. It's a mirror, reflecting our own beliefs about what it means to be human, the choices we might make when faced with the unimaginable. It's a story that stays with you long after you've heard it, prompting you to ask yourself, what would I have done?
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, even when confronted with the most, well, horrific choices, the human spirit can endure, can find a way forward, and can emerge from tragedy with a newfound appreciation for that, precious, fragile gift of life.
That's a powerful thought. And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the Andes flight disaster. It's a story that chills, it inspires, and ultimately reminds us of the boundless capacity of the, human spirit. Thanks for joining us, folks. We'll catch you on our next deep dive into the unknown.